Hey everyone, welcome back to Beyond the Rhetoric. So I'd like to begin this conversation today talking about the society we live in, kind of society we aspire to live in, and what that means for our acceptance of the different values that we see in society. So I think I'd like to begin just by saying oftentimes I think there's a myth that there is a homogenous society, that our society is a certain way of thinking and being, a certain value system, whatever. And I think that's not really a very accurate way of looking at it. We're a very mixed bag society. There's never been a certain look to people in our country, just one look. Background, certainly ways of thinking, value systems, anything else. We're a very diverse society. And what would make that not very challenging is if we were aspiring to be a totalitarian state, right? Where the government just said, this is the way things are. And then it wouldn't really matter that we kind of had differences. We would all just have to kind of toe the line. But we aspire to be a society that is, in principle, free and democratic. And but it's to be free and democratic in a society that is inherently diverse, as a pluralistic society, means that we have to be open to difference, welcoming of difference. Because if not, then what we're really saying is we want to have a homogenous totalitarian society where whoever wins gets to dictate certain ways of thinking and valuing or whatever. So I want to introduce an idea that I found useful in kind of thinking through this dilemma. Now, to give credit where credit is due, a lot of the things I'm talking about today are from Isaiah Berlin. So he was a political theorist, kind of philosopher, very, very famous at Oxford last century. I think he died in like the 90s, was especially famous in the 60s and 70s, from Latvia. He labeled himself a Russian Jew that lived in England and yada yada. And he's famous for a lot of things. But the one I want to talk about today was his idea of value pluralism. So in developing this idea, Berlin basically said that there's some assumptions that people have about truth that are really just, that don't hold up to scrutiny, even though they may seem intuitive. So one is that for any given question, for any genuine question, there's one true answer, and anything other than that is an error. And that to get to this one true answer, there's one true path. There's one legitimate, most justifiable way of approaching a given question. And if you use the right path, you get to the one true answer. And then I think for the big epiphany that I think he had, and that I think also when I read his stuff that I did, was that the idea that if you do find a true answer, that it'll be perfectly compatible with other true answers to similar related problems. And so the whole idea of value pluralism is that these three things are just simply not true. That for any given genuine question, there could be multiple justifiable answers depending on the path that you take to get there. And by path, like what perspective are you taking on it? What angle are you taking on it? And that oftentimes is driven by underlying values. You value something, and so you're looking through that lens at a particular problem. And that brought him to this notion of value pluralism. So the idea is that in any given society, there are ideological concepts, moral concepts that are competing with each other, because there really is no purely homogenous society. And especially the more diverse a society is, the more you're going to get these competitions, if you will, between ideas, concepts, values, morals, whatever. And sometimes they're incompatible with each other. And by incompatible, they land you on different sides of an issue, even though neither one is inherently wrong. And what I thought was really important was the emphasis that Berlin placed on the effort to try to find one totalizing truth. To say that, no, there's one way of thinking about this, there's one answer to be found, there's one value system that trumps all the rest. He says, any effort like that is almost by definition totalitarianism. And their totalitarian government is, where the government has absolute control over everything. But in this sense, it's when you say there's one way of thinking and valuing, and that should be the one that controls everything. That should win because it's right. And Berlin was saying that's just simply not true. And the effort to get there is wrong. And so instead of trying to compete in a way that one's ideas, one's value systems are just win out and they control everything, he says what we have to do in a free society is we have to get comfortable with there being different values. Now we need to not, we can't just allow anything. Like we do have to have a line that we draw, like what values are we not going to espouse. But beyond that line, we have to be comfortable that there will always be competing values. And that doesn't mean other people are immoral or dumb or anything else. And there's an important distinction to make. I mean, value pluralism is not relativism. So relativism would say all values are equally good. You can never justify any value over another one. I mean, that's, I think that it's not what Berlin was saying, and I would think there'd be a problem with that because there are some values that are inherently just hurtful. But again, where do we draw the line? But value pluralism also rejects the idea that there's some kind of synthesis that's even possible. That if all of us right-thinking people got together, we could figure out the truth, and then we would just know the right way of thinking about things. And Berlin is saying, that's just, no, there is no, it's not possible. You could create something and treat it like that, and in so doing, create a totalitarian society, which would be wrong. But if you want to live in a relatively free society, then we need to give up this idea that there's one way of looking at it. We need to be more comfortable with accepting differences in values. And so, although there are many good worldviews and opinions and value systems, there aren't an infinite number. We do need a way of thinking about how we draw a line in the sand. And I don't know of a real clean way to make this dividing line between what's an acceptable value and what's an unacceptable value. The way that Berlin talked about it was it had to be within the human horizon. And I'm not particularly impressed with the clarity with which he defined that. I think he left it somewhat vague, but I appreciate that it's difficult to define that exactly. A way that I tend to think about it is if there are value systems that they allow for human flourishing, like they're not blatantly like whatever's good for me is and bad for others is the way it's going to be. Like that's a bad value system, and I think that manifests in different ways. But value systems that just allow for people to thrive, that doesn't cause me to infringe on other people's lives. I think within that, then I think that's the drawing line for me. And I think as a society, I think it's fair enough to say we should have conversations about that, right? But as a quick and dirty definition, that's kind of how I tend to think about it. So Berlin would say, for instance, there are human values of justice, compassion, etc., that they're all good. Like it's hard to argue that any of them are bad. It's actually kind of hard to argue which one is inherently better than another one, although for you they might be. So for instance, justice and compassion are two values that are often kind of juxtaposed to each other. And let's say in the criminal justice system or something like that, there's a need for justice is an important value. Compassion is an important value. And it's not in any given situation, it seems to me that it's never either or. There's kind of a tension between them. And the tension that I hold between them may favor compassion over justice. And the tension that another person holds in that situation might be justice over compassion. And I think what Isaiah Berlin was saying is, for us to live in a free society, this idea of value pluralism means we need to be okay that, look, these are both good values. If somebody prioritizes one over another, we need to be okay with that. So let me give a concrete example to illustrate how I see this idea playing out. So I'm borrowing from an article that I read a while ago, and it doesn't really matter, the citation's there, but it was in the article they talked about an actual conversation that happened, and I kind of like it as an example because to me it's the kind of conversations that happen a lot. So in this conversation, we have Mike and Alana. They are both good friends. Mike is a working class guy who's very conservative, and he's complaining to Alana. He's about taxes that he pays. He's like, in taxes here in New York where we live, they're way too high. They're 10 times higher than in South Carolina, and this is just wrong. And Alana, the liberal, counters that and says, well, those taxes are justified because they go to things that help people in need. They pay for hungry children's breakfasts. And Mike says, I don't care. I don't want to be taxed to pay for other kids' breakfast. I pay for my kids' breakfast. Other people pay for their kids' breakfast. And Alana looks at him like, have you no heart? You don't care. And he looks at her like, what kind of world do you live in that you think people should just rely on the government for help? And then the argument just stalls and they just walk away, just like, we're friends, but I just don't understand you whatsoever. So the way that it seems to me that would be a productive way to move forward is to have two types of analysis, if you will. It's just a nerdy way of saying, let's talk about this a couple different ways. and it leads us eventually to what I feel is a really productive conversation around values. So, one, I don't believe in debate. I think it's worthless, almost worthless, because it's a competition. I think what we need is a seeking to understand each other. So, if I were involved in this conversation, I'd like to think that I would say, instead of trying to convince each other who's right and who's wrong, let's try to get to the bottom of this. So, how much exactly are taxes in New York and in South Carolina? Because just if property values are a lot higher in one place over another, it's unfair to say taxes are higher. You're just paying tax on what you have more value in the property. And if property taxes or whatever in New York are higher than in South Carolina, and I think they probably are, but I don't know, they're not 10 times higher. I can guarantee you that. They're not 10 times. So to say that into an argument that they're 10 times higher, I'm not being just nitpicky here. That's a big deal because they're not 10 times higher. How much higher are they? 1%? What does that equate to? I'm not saying that let's be clear about what we're talking about. And then I would look at the state budgets, which I think those are all publicly available, not necessarily easy to find. But I'm fairly familiar with the state budget of the state that I live in. And this idea that New York taxes are higher because they provide social services such as breakfast for free children. They do those things, but South Carolina does too. So I would look at the state budget and say, this is where your taxes are going. How much of those are for social services? Because my guess is that's not really moving the dial on things. That's not the big reason why taxes are different, assuming they are different. And if I'm right, and if the difference is because, I don't know, New York is a union state and all public employees, let's say all school teachers, and by the way, education is a huge part of any state budget. If the school teachers in New York make a lot more, have a lot better benefits, if they're police officers, make more, have better benefits, whatever it is, that's why taxes would be higher more than just breakfast for hungry children. And if that's true, then it's manipulative to say we pay higher taxes and it's justified because it feeds hungry children. That's factually not correct. That's not a big factor in it. And so it's not, if we're trying to really seek to understand that, that's not a good argument to put forward. So first of all, I would begin with that. Like let's talk in real terms rather than talking about platitudes. And all that's important, I think, because one, arguing about platitudes through platitudes isn't beneficial at all. But once you're clear on the facts, if you want to talk about taxes and budget expenditures at the state level, then let's get the facts right first, and then we can have a conversation around, in analyzing that situation, what facts are we paying attention to? What's being focused on and what's being ignored? And we're both going to come at that from different angles. If we're on two sides of an issue, usually we can both be factually correct and still disagree on stuff. And it's like, I'm paying attention to certain aspects of this very complex problem because of whatever, because that's how it was framed for me, or maybe because of a value system I have that causes me to look at certain things and prioritize them over others. And somebody else is looking at it differently, right? They're framing it differently. And that can lead us to some very productive conversations about what are the values underlying our perspective on this issue. So the way I read the situation is, when I hear Mike talking, I hear him saying basically that in order for this to work, in order for society to function, self-sufficiency is really important. I would guess that self-sufficiency was kind of a narrative in the home that he was raised in, that he feels it's an essential part of our culture, and it's an essential part of government and people, of this whole system working. We have to have self-sufficient people. And so he's just saying, look, you can try to, exercise empathy, whatever, but this whole thing's going to come crashing down if too many people abuse it, if people aren't self-sufficient. So I'm not saying he's right or wrong. I'm saying that's where he's coming from, I think. And if he is, then he's coming from a value system that's prioritizing self-sufficiency. And according to the line I draw in the sand, does this allow for human flourishing? I'm like, yeah, self-sufficiency is not an evil value. I can get behind that. I need to respect Mike's valuing of that. And when I hear Alana speaking, I hear she's coming at a place from empathy and maybe a place of fairness. I think she would be arguing, for one thing, it's not exactly a level playing field. There's a lot of factors that go into why some people at some point in time need these social services and supports. Regardless of all that, how can you ever blame a child if their parents can't feed them? The child should go hungry. How could you dare do that? So she's coming at this place of care, of empathy, of something like that. And I can get behind that as a value system. But I think this is where the conversation gets productive. If they can get past just the bull crap of 10 times higher taxes and feeding hungry children, and just stop it. Get down to brass tacks about how much more are we talking and what does it really go to. And then we can talk about that. And then we can talk about, in this situation, what is the tension between self-sufficiency and empathy that we should use in thinking through this. And it could be that Mike or Alana might kind of nuance their thinking a little bit. It could be that at the end of the conversation, they both kind of were where they're at, but maybe they appreciate where the other person's coming from in terms of their value system. So just to kind of circle back to the beginning, I really don't like the idea of living in a society where people walk around saying, I believe what I believe, and I think the way I think, and I value what I value because that's just how I was raised. I hate that. That's just lazy. All of us were born into imperfect social worlds. All of us have imperfect ways of thinking about the world, whatever. So we should, I think, always kind of be open to critiquing whatever. At the same time, I'm very uncomfortable with kind of an extreme postmodern view of there is no truth. Because it seems to me whenever that's said, there's an unspoken subtext that says there's no truth, but everyone needs to think the way I do. And I could be wrong on that. I could be unfair in that, but I kind of get that vibe a lot. And then what I've been talking about in this video is there's also, the idea that there is one truth and every correct thinking person should see it. And that's not very helpful either. That's where I think I really found value when I stumbled across Isaiah Berlin a couple years ago. I like this idea of no, let's have a way of drawing a line in the sand about what values we are not going to accept in society. But beyond that, let's quit having this tacit assumption that the way that I see things, the way that I value things, is the right way, and everybody needs to come to that right way. It's not a healthy way to try to foster a free society. It is, by definition, totalitarian. Totalitarian. And as I talk a lot in these videos between left and right, neither side is innocent in this regard. I think especially the more extreme a person gets, the more they're tacitly saying, no, the way I'm looking at the world is the right way of looking at the world. And it's not that we just have to give up and say people are people. We can always try to convince people of our values. But I think we function better as society when we approach those conversations about values and views and whatever from a place that's of genuine respect. Like if I can genuinely say, look, I'm coming at this problem from a position of empathy. You're coming at it from one of self-sufficiency. They really are both important values. There's a level of respect here. I can respect your view you have on that. Great. So now let's maybe talk along those lines. It makes just for a much more healthy, much more effective way of living together in what is a very diverse society.